Today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast, what is the nature of man and why is it we have all these conflicting feelings about, life and stuff like that? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Last time I had mentioned that I was planning on doing a series on anthropology and ethics, and here we go. We're jumping into it today. So I know that anthropology is one of those sexy topics that people are like, man, can't wait to dig into some anthropology. But here, actually, hopefully, it will be rather engaging and intriguing. Let me give you a little bit of a roadmap of where I see this going. Now, as you know, experience with me tells you that sometimes when I plot one episode, it becomes two or three, two episodes become four or five or things like that. So I am planning this for 3 episodes. We'll see if I stay on target. But here's the basic roadmap that, I'm looking at here as we're jumping into this topic. What I want to do is I want to talk a little bit today about just the way in which ancient people thought about the human person and how that thinking about the human person ultimately related to their understanding of the nature of good and of evil and ultimately of ethics. Or, what is it that constitutes the good life? Why are we here? What does it mean to live a good life? What is our purpose? And ultimately, that really was, in the ancient world, the entire point of morality. It wasn't just sort of like an ethical code for how do we, conduct ourselves as doctors or something like that. Instead, it was a question of what is the good life, right? What am I? Why am I here? How ought I to live? So we'll look at the ways in which pagan philosophy and then, Jewish and Christian philosophy ultimately began to tackle those questions. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the ways in which that began to change, right? Some of the shifts that started to happen in how people thought about the human person when you started to get into the, basically into the modern period. And you had these shifts towards rationalism and empiricism and how that affected the perspective on who are we and ultimately into ethics. And as you'll see throughout this entire series, what you'll end up seeing is that there is a strong connection between how you see the human person and how you understand the nature of morality and ethics. And then we'll talk about some of the odd anthropologies that emerge today. And in saying odd, I'm not trying to here sort of poison the well, but just to point out that some of the things we'll talk about in terms of perspectives on self-actualization, for example, that have become prominent in our contemporary culture actually are historically rather peculiar. So that's what I mean by calling them odd. So that's the focus on today. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which the human person was understood and perceived and how that was tied into the understanding and the picture of morality and the good life that began to emerge throughout the history of ideas. Part 2 of this, what I'm anticipating next time, and again, we'll see if I go long, but part 2 of this, I wanted to actually start to talk about ethical systems, meta-ethics in particular, and go through the various sort of moral models, as it were, that people utilize in order to try to explicate the nature of morality. So you'll actually notice, and again, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but a lot of people are unaware that when they start to talk about, that's right or that's wrong, or, they get into these sort of ethical disputes about a certain topic, be it abortion or homosexuality or whatever. There's normally this sort of vagueness about what people mean by right and wrong. There's a vagueness about how they discern what's right and wrong. A lot of people are just sort of going on vague moral intuitions on the one hand, or they're relying on something like the Bible on the other. But there's an entire field called ethics, and specifically meta-ethics, that being my favorite, where you're actually talking about going from the metaphysical side, the nature of reality, to the meta-ethical side and saying, well, given the nature of reality, what is the nature of good and evil, right and wrong? What do these terms mean? And ultimately, what is the sort of structure of reality that informs what makes something right and wrong. And as you'll see in that second episode, we'll talk about the fact that there are a variety of different ways of understanding the structure of morality. And that's rather important because what you'll see is different ways of discerning and understanding that structure affects how you begin to make ethical assessments. So we'll actually dig in part 2, talking about the specific moral models that are out there and just look at the different ways in which those differences between those moral models ultimately affect the ways in which people think about right and wrong, good and evil, and then specific moral topics. The last step that I want to do, and this is part 3, and again, presuming I can actually stick to 3 parts. Part 3, I want to look at some of the specifically Christian areas of anthropology. Now, this is me acknowledging that even though I am a philosopher, a lot of the folks who come here, they come here because they're interested in Eastern Orthodoxy, or they're interested in me as a Christian philosopher, or specifically an Eastern Orthodox philosopher. And a lot of the things that folks are interested in, specifically with what I'm talking about, has to do with the fact that I talk about these differences between East and West, between the sort of Western Latin traditions on into really modernity, and the contrast with things that you find in the Eastern Church Fathers, which is oftentimes very different than the majority of what you find in Western tradition. And I think a lot of folks are interested in hearing those sorts of contrasting distinctions. By the way, I am planning on doing, just a little bit of a teaser here, I am planning on doing an entire series just on East-West differences generally and bouncing around through different topics, anthropology, theology, and so on. So in that part 3, I really want to dig into these questions of what are the differences between how the East and the West sees the nature of man, and how that starts to play out in a variety of areas of worldview and theology and so on and so forth. So that's our roadmap. Part 1 today will be on the nature of man and this sort of history of anthropology, very brief history of anthropology. Part 2 on ethical systems, metaethics, and how that relates and is an extension of anthropology. And then part 3 looking at specifically East-West divides within Christian anthropology. So with that, let's go ahead and jump on in. Now, perhaps those of you who have listened to the Problem of Evil series that I did will remember this point that I made about the ancient world and how they looked at the nature of evil. So one of the things about pagan philosophy is that it recognized right away that there is a certain tension within the world, that there are things that we identify as good and things we identify as bad or as evil. And part of the question is, what's going on there, right? How are we to understand this tension, this polarity or duality within the world? And I started there, obviously, in the context of the problem of evil, because I was addressing the question, well, what is evil? When you say that there is evil in the world, what is it that we're talking about? We should probably define that term. And I talked about the fact that within the ancient pagan context, there were several different offerings on hand, as it were. So one of those was to say, well, that polarity is exactly what it seems. There is this force in the world that we call good, and in some ways, for some of these systems, that was identified as a god. This is the sort of thing you see like in Empedocles, where you have a good god. And then on the other hand, you have these evil forces in the world. And those are also identified as equal and opposing gods. So in Empedocles, this is love and strife are basically the names of the two principles that are at work in the world. Love is the thing that begins to order things and bring harmony to the world, and then strife comes in and begins to break apart those things and create chaos and break them back down to the natural elements. And this is basically how Empedocles explained the tension that we see within our own experience when looking out into the world, that there really are two principles at work, and that's why we encounter good things that are indicative of harmony and love and order. It's also why we encounter things that are chaotic and broken and destructive and vile, because there are two principles at work, one working toward the harmony and the good of things, the other working toward the destruction and chaos of things. And that is referred to as metaphysical dualism. And metaphysical dualism within the ancient world, it takes on a variety of forms. Now, in Empedocles, it's not obvious that the elements, which is what's being brought together into harmony and broken apart, have any sort of like good or evil. They seem to sort of be sort of neutral materials that can be brought into harmony, which is good, or thrown into chaos and breakdown and corruption, which is evil. Whereas in other forms of metaphysical dualism, you end up having, a sort of an association of good with the spiritual things of reality and evil with the physical things of reality. So Manichaeism and Gnosticism are sort of known for this, where they tend to identify the fleshly and gross matter of the body as in some ways the evil principle, and the spiritual and the ethereal as in some ways good. And in this way, you have not only a spiritual polarity, right, between the moral or the spiritual good and evil, but you actually also have a substantial polarity where matter is in some ways associated with evil and spiritual things are associated with good. So that's another form of metaphysical dualism. Now in Platonism, you have yet another form of this type of dualism. Now Platonism doesn't rely as heavily on the idea of good and evil, deities that are in some ways at war, like you might have with somebody like Empedocles, or even the warring good and evil and the polarity that you have in Manichaeism. Instead, there is a tendency to see matter itself as sort of a unstable and unreliable principle. So within Platonism, if you're talking about Platonism proper, Plato, you have the demiurge, right, God, who looks at the forms, which are the object of his contemplation. These are the sort of nature of things. So when we look out into the world and we see genera and species and structures and things like that, what we're seeing, according to Plato, are the forms, the nature and the structures of things. And he thinks that what we see here in the material world is a replica of some, transcendent order. And he calls that transcendent order the forms. And so he believes that there are these archetypes that precede the material world. Those are the objects of God's contemplation. And what God does is he looks at matter, which is the second principle that's disordered and is just kind of chaotic. It has no shape, it has no structure. And desiring all things to be like him as possible, he ends up crafting it and modeling it. That's why he's called the demiurge. Demiurgus, it means a craftsman. He ends up crafting matter to be modeled or to replicate as best it can, and that's the key part for what we're talking about, as best it can, the forms. And so that's where you start to get instances of human, modeled after the archetype of human. That's where you get instances, multiple instances of dog, modeled after the archetype of canine, and so on. But, and here's the important thing, after God goes back to finishes crafting the world, he entrusts it to the gods and to rational beings. They're the ones who are supposed to tend to it. He goes back to contemplating the forms. The fact of the matter is, for Plato, he understands matter to just be inherently unstable, unpredictable. And so when explaining in some way, right, the question of like, well, why is there chaotic stuff? Why are there corruptions and evil and chaotic things that happen in our world? For a Platonist like Plato, it just becomes, well, that's just sort of the nature of the material you're dealing with, right? It's just inherently unstable and unpredictable. This is sort of like the best approximation it can make of the order of the forms, but you're dealing with something that's inherently unstable. Now, admittedly, later Neoplatonists, you end up having some actually suggest that matter is intentionally, like that they give it some form of agency and make it a little more malevolent, as if it's actually thwarting the will of God. But in general, what you end up having is you have this spectrum throughout the metaphysical dualists of everything from there are two principles, two gods at war, and that's the basis of it, to there are gods at war and there are also two material principles, spirit and matter, to there are just two principles, right? There's spirit and matter. Now, of course, the Platonists would also add that we also have free will, right? There are things within the created order that depend upon us. That's sort of the telltale phrase when the pagan philosophers talk about free will. That's one of the things they talk about, the things that depend on us, where you and I have choices about how to operate within the world. And that's, of course, another factor in why we experience evil and chaos and things like that in the world because of rational agents who make choices that are chaotic and evil. So that's one explanation of why there is this polarity within our experience. Now, another explanation is that the polarity is just really, it's subjective, right? Like that explanation that I just provided, metaphysical dualism, ends up offering some sort of principle rooted in physics, in the nature of things, in reality itself. It actually is ontological. Good and evil are features of reality. But you do have other views, pantheist views, that end up suggesting that good and evil are really subjective terms. And this is the sort of thing that, again, looking to the pagans, you can find in somebody like Heraclitus. So Heraclitus suggests that all things are ordered, right, by the logos, right, this rational principle, the logos there being a signifier of the divine mind that orders all things, which a lot of the pagan philosophers talked about. And logos was one of the terms they would sometimes use to refer to it. And Heraclitus actually goes ahead and he talks about this world order, and he talks about these cosmic world cycles. Now, Heraclitus is sort of known for talking about the transient nature of things. If you've ever heard of Heraclitus, you've probably actually heard the phrase that you can't step into the same river twice. And people will always point that out as the quintessential Heraclitus sort of statement, because what he's talking about is the fact that all things are transient. They're here and then they're gone. They're always changing. They're always mutating. But to take from that Heraclitus thinks there's no order things would be a misunderstanding. The more accurate phrase, right, for Heraclitus, there's actually a passage, I think it's called a posset. I think that's what the ancient, basically drink was called. It's almost like imagine what is it, a Thousand Island dressing or something like that, one of these oil and vinegar dressings that you might use on salad, and how you have to shake it up, and then it mixes together, and then if you let it settle, it separates. And a posset was sort of an ancient drink that was kind of like that. It functioned like that. I think I'm remembering the term right. Posset, am I getting it right? Anyway, we'll pretend for right now that I'm getting it right. But that's how it functioned, right? It functioned in this sort of, if you mix it up, it stays, together, and if you let it settle, it begins to separate. And Heraclitus talks about this paradox where he says the posset is only stable when it's moving, or that it's only still when it's moving, something like that, depending on how you translate it. But the point of what Heraclitus is getting at is the paradox here is that the stability of the thing is actually rooted in the movement, and when you stop the movement and you let it rest, it begins to separate and break apart and moves into chaos. And I think that's really a clear picture of what you actually have with Heraclitus, where Heraclitus is saying, yes, the world is moving through all these different sort of cycles, right? Things are coming to be and going away. They're growing and then they're decaying, but it's all part of the circle of life, to cite a popular children's movie. And the idea being that circle of life ultimately does have order. It is ordered by the logos, right? By this divine mind that orders all things. And so because of that, what Heraclitus ended up saying with regard to good and evil is he ended up suggesting that a man has a tendency to call some things just and other things unjust. But really, if we could see them from the divine perspective, we would understand that all things are just. And here, of course, what Heraclitus is doing is he's acknowledging that in some ways, our experience when we say that's an evil or that's bad, we're really just saying we find it unpleasant and we don't like it. But what Heraclitus wants to say is that it is all orderly, and from the divine perspective, it is all good. And so in this sense, Heraclitus really does reject evil as an illusion, and that always is another possibility. So when we're talking about the nature of good and evil, one possibility is that there is an actual polarity, like we find in the metaphysical dualists. The other possibility is that evil is an illusion, and it's not actually a thing. We're just talking subjectively about not liking certain things. And then the third possibility that I talked about, again, at length within that series on the problem of evil, is the Christian view that begins to emerge that evil is a privation or a distortion. And here, the basic concept was that, yes, evil is real, but it is not additive. Rather, it is distorting or subtractive. And so some of the easiest examples with regard to this is something like blindness, right? When you're talking about blindness is not an additive property. It's not that you've added something to the eye. Rather, the perfection and the good of the eye, when it is properly formed and fulfilling its proper end or telos, it sees. And when you deprive it of that, when it's distorted in such a way that it no longer fulfills that purpose, now you have an evil. But that evil is not the addition of something to the eye. Rather, it is a subtraction. It is a divergence from proper formation and from proper function, and that's what we call evil. And this was the Christian view because, of course, building on the Jewish scriptures, the Genesis narrative, when God creates things, all things are good. And it's through the exercise of will that things end up being distorted and twisted. And so on the Christian account, what you end up seeing is that when you're talking about evil, what you are actually talking about is some introduction of a corruption or a twisting or a divergence from proper formation, and the root of that is always free creatures. Now, this, of course, as you know, in the Christian narrative, free creatures are in some ways locked into the cosmic organism. And so when that organ goes wrong, that central organ, and that's an important part of it, in the Christian narrative, humanity is central to the structure and the order and ultimately the hope of the cosmos, something, again, I talk about in that Problem of Evil episode, as well as in Man's Place in the Cosmos episode. When that central organ goes cancerous, then what happens is the entire organ, the entire organism ends up being corrupted. It ends up getting sick and twisted and distorted. And so this is where there's a ripple effect within Christianity in its understanding of the effect, right, that root cause of humanity and angels making choices that end up introducing evil and chaos and destruction into the world. So those are your three explanations, right? That evil is actually indicative of two realities of a certain duality. And that could be two gods. It could be two material, substantial principles. It could be a combination of both. But you have a duality. The second possibility is that you have an illusion. It's not so, right? Evil is not actually so. And then the third possibility is that evil is real, but it is not an additive feature of reality. Rather, it is a privative or a twisting, a corruption of reality. Those are your three. Now, the reason I bring that up, why do I start there if I'm going to talk about the nature of man? I think the important thing to recognize is that when you're talking about the ways in which the ancients try to understand man, the fact that we have within our experience some sort of duality, some sort of polarity, is central to how they're trying to understand the nature of man. Because the fact of the matter is that you and I, in our experience a polarity all the time. We have certain values, certain desires, certain aspirations that pull us in one direction, and then there's also something else that pulls us in a different direction. We all know what it's like to have certain ideals. It could be a simple ideal like, I'm going to start exercising more or eating better, and then we have this pull in another direction that says, well, yes, but laziness or sleeping in or whatever just feels so good, or that this other food is so enticing, maybe I do want that instead. And so in simple things, we have that sort of polarity in our experiences. We all know what that's like. But we also experience this on what we might call a more cosmic level, where many of us know what it's like to have certain aspirations for a certain type of lifestyle, right? Well, there are certain goals that we have in life. We want to achieve this thing, in terms of our career, or we want to achieve this thing, attain a certain type of relationship, or we want to attain that thing. It might be very sort of materialistic, a bigger house or a nicer house or something like that. And we have this sense, we all know what it's like to have this experience of achieving something, having the thrill of achieving that something, and yet still finding ourselves feeling that there must be something more because it doesn't fully satisfy. And that's another form of this polarity where there is something within us that's saying, there has to be more to life than this, right? The existential crisis that says there must be more than this. Provincial life. Why am I on like Disney themed slogans here this morning? I don't know, but we're going to run with it. So the sense that there must be more than this, and yet, we find ourselves pursuing this sort of baseline existence, and it oftentimes leaves us, empty. And so there's again, an indicative of a certain polarity that says part of us looks around and identifies various goods, says if we could get those goods, that would be life. We experience those, we get a hold of those, we grab those, and then some other part of us says, yeah, but that's not the thing I really long for. And there's this longing for something more. And so part of the question that begins to emerge for the pagans is not just, why is it that there is good and evil or order and chaos that's out there, as it were, out in society, or in the news. Rather, it's also a question about how do we understand this polarity that we experience within our own lives and within our own person. So even though we are one person, right, we have many parts, but we seem to be those parts seem to make up like one person who has all of those parts. Like we seem to be just like one being, one guy that's pressing through space and time, and yet somehow there is a disharmony or an internal conflict within us. It's there on the small level, such as, small aspirations and desires that run into conflict with one another. And it's there on this more, sort of global, cosmic, existential level, where we have certain desires that pull us in one direction, and yet that direction ends up leaving a different part of us unsatisfied and longing for something more, perhaps something transcendent, you might say. And part of the question they're asking is, why is that, right? What does that tell us about the nature of man? So when you look at ancient anthropology, it's inherently dualistic. You find that there is a tendency, and I don't mean dualistic in the sense that it favors metaphysical dualism, but what I mean is that it has a tendency or a natural sort of trajectory toward some sort of duality in how it understands the human person. And as we'll see, that duality varies, right? Not everyone agrees on the nature of that duality, but that there is some sort of duality in us seems to be just basic to the ways in which the ancients approach anthropology, and for good reason, for the very reasons we mentioned. Now, in the case of metaphysical dualists, this duality ends up reflecting the very sort of metaphysical commitments that they hold about the nature of the world and about the nature of good and evil. And this is something that basically, thematically, you will notice throughout this entire series that we're talking about, where we're talking about anthropology and ethics. And this is one of the reasons why, if you've heard me talk about in the past, these sort of multi-levels of discourse, and I normally talk about the sort of 4 levels of discourse. Incidentally, I originally thought about naming this Level 4, this podcast Level 4, rather than the Nathan Jacobs podcast, because I think that's so central to how to look at the ways in which people engage in certain topics. But for those who are unfamiliar with this, what I talked about is I would always use this. I would hearken back to a time when I taught bioethics to a group of physicians, and I could tell that they really just wanted me to offer them that that silver bullet that's just going to let them give all the right answers to the administrators and to their patients, and they're just going to come around on the moral issues. And unfortunately, I had to break the news. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen. It's not that you can't reason with people. Of course, you can reason with people, but the difficulty is that most dialogue, most discourse that people engage in actually lives on a certain surface level that is in some ways a bit immune to actually going to the deeper core issues where the differences in worldview and the differences in conclusions ultimately lie. So the way I've talked about this is there's sort of if we're talking about like ethics or something like that, there's that sort of surface level where it's just sort of bumper sticker sloganeering, right? The idea that hate is not a family value, or that it's a child, not a choice, right? Things like that. These sort of sloganeering things that are just sort of giving you the ultimate like conclusion of this is my position, right? And that's the superficial soundbite sort of level of discourse, where you're just sort of hurling your position in another person in soundbite form. Beneath that is sort of level 2, and that's where you begin to get into longer form discourse, where you're starting to say like, look, you can't just do this because yada, yada, yada. And at that level 2, as I've pointed out in the past, more words are exchanged and it seems more substantive. But at the end of the day, people are not really talking about what they mean by the words good and evil. They're not talking about why they think something is right and wrong. So at the end of the day, it still is, I'm standing over here with my presuppositions, with my metaphysics, with my metaethics, and from that position, I am telling you what I think, and you are standing over there with your worldview, your metaphysics, your metaethics, and you're hurling at me your case for your position, but we're not really digging down beneath the surface to see where we really disagree, because we're talking about what's called applied ethics. You're saying that you think abortion is morally permissible. I'm saying that I think it's morally impermissible. And we're going back and forth with a lot of words to try to sort of help the other person see our position. But what we're not talking about yet is, what do we mean by morally permissible or impermissible? What do we mean by right and wrong? And what do we think when we use those words? What do we think the structures of right and wrong really are? And we're not talking about that. Most people truthfully don't, right? Most discourse within our culture it begins at, sort of soundbite level. And then even in the long form, it tends to live at level 2. And it rarely scratches down into the world of level 3. But level 3 is the place where I've talked about metaethics, where you're actually saying, look, when I say right and wrong, good and evil, this is what I mean by those. I don't mean pleasant, unpleasant. I think it's actually, it's rooted in the nature of things. I think it has objective qualities, etc. And I think structurally this is how it works, and so on. Or I'm just a hedonist, and I think right and wrong, good and evil just refers to pleasure and pain, and so on, and that's why I'm a utilitarian. Those are the sorts of discussions we'll talk about when we get to metaethics, and talk about that in the next episode. But people rarely get down to that level. And that's where the real divide is happening, because you haven't even really defined your terms if you're just saying, I think that's wrong. And you haven't even defined what you mean by wrong. And then the fourth level is ultimately, that's beneath metaethics. That's where you get to metaphysics. And that's where you're actually talking about what is the nature of reality. And what you'll find is that usually, not usually, it's just the way these things work, is that your metaphysics, right, your underlying worldview is ultimately what begins to give rise to or give birth to your ethics, right? How you see the world is also how you start to see right and wrong, good and evil, and how you begin to discern the structure and the nature of those terms, what they really mean. And so this is what I've always meant by 4 levels of discourse, that the underlying metaphysics or the worldview is the deepest level that provides the underlying structure for what you're really talking about. Metaethics is where we're moving from that structure to how we're understanding the specific feature of reality, right and wrong, good and evil, and how it works, how it's structured, how we discern it. And then at that second level, now you're into applied ethics. Based on that, based on seeing the world in this way, this is what I think about that topic. And then from there, you can get into sound bites. Now, that, like I said, that's going to be an extension. You'll see that throughout this entire series as we talk about anthropology and ethics, that there is a close tie between how they see the world, how they see anthropology, and how a person ultimately sees ethics. And so it's no wonder that within the ancient and pagan context that you start to see that, well, lo and behold, people who are metaphysical dualists and think there actually are 2 principles to the world, that belief that there are 2 polarized, opposing opposing principles within the world that are the basis for the polarity we experience, lo and behold, they actually think that polarity exists within us too. And so this is where you get a couple of different types of anthropologies along that line. The one anthropology is, of course, the Manichaeistic or the Gnostic ones. These are the sort of mystery cults that I think a lot of people who know at least a little something about historical Christianity are familiar with, because the Christians oftentimes ran into these mystery cults. Manichaeism was one version of a mystery cult that ultimately ended up adopting or appropriating aspects of Christianity. And so people like Augustine of Hippo, before he ended up converting to Christianity, was, at least in some loose fashion, a Manichaeist. And he talks about this in his Confessions, if you read his Confessions, which you should. It's a great work. And so you see, when you look at the Manichaeists or the Gnostics, there is a tendency to see salvation as ultimately liberation from the flesh. Well, why, right? Why is that? Well, the reason is because if you think that good and evil are ultimately substantive realities, such that the spirit is good and the flesh is evil, then what you can do is you can naturally see, well, clearly the flesh, it's not redeemable, right? It's not just that the flesh is somehow twisted or corrupted, it's inherently evil. And in this sense, it's unredeemable. And so redemption ultimately has to do with liberating that good part of you from the evil part of you. This is one of the reasons why it is ultimately about the liberation of the spirit from the flesh. So the explanation for the polarity we feel is that there is actual war between us. There is a spiritual part of us that desires good things, that is good and desires good things, and then there's a fleshly part of us that is evil. And those two things are in conflict, they're at war with each other, and ultimately salvation has to do with the liberation of the one from the other. This is incidentally also why certain Christological heresies about Christ, that emerged from the Gnostics oftentimes rejected the incarnation. So if you've ever heard of Docetism, right? Docetism is the Christological heresy that suggests that Christ actually didn't take on flesh. He was a phantasm. And now why would somebody say that, right? Well, they would say that because ultimately, if you really do believe that God is good, right? That the Son of God is good. He can't taint himself by becoming flesh, right? That would ultimately somehow merge him with the evil principle. So that can't be the case. And that's one of the reasons why the sort of Gnostic heretics had a tendency to say, well, Christ didn't really take on flesh. He just looked like he was in the flesh. Ultimately, he wouldn't do that sort of thing. He's pure spirit. He's just a phantasm. And that's something that you see ultimately, it seems like that heresy is already there. John, the Apostle John, is dealing with it in 1 John already. And then you also see it in St. Ignatius quite thoroughly, where he's appealing to the Eucharist, for example, and saying, well, why are we talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood if he doesn't have flesh and blood? And so anyway, there were all sorts of polemics related to that. But you can understand why, thinking through anthropology from the perspective of the metaphysical dualist, you can understand why there would be a tendency in that direction. Now, that's sort of the extreme form of metaphysical dualism. As I mentioned, there's kind of a spectrum between it. Everything from, well, there are two warring principles, like in Empedocles, to there are warring principles and substantial principles, like in Manichaeism. But then within Platonism, you have a little bit of the backing off of the sort of war of the gods, as it were, where it's not that you have this war of good and evil happening, but you more have a chaotic principle, and it leans more heavily into the two principles. And that's actually reflected again in Plato, right? So as I mentioned, for Plato, matter isn't really evil, it's just sort of chaotic. And so in this sense, it's just sort of like the chaos you see is just a byproduct of the inherent instability of it. As I said, later there is you find some Neoplatonists who start to make it more malevolent and make it a little bit more like some of the metaphysical dualisms you might find in Gnosticism or Manichaeism. But within Plato himself, it's certainly just a principle of instability. And by the way, that's not all Neoplatonists who go that route. But so when you have this sort of softer version of metaphysical dualism, then what you have is you have something that is indicative of a lot of the things that we find in Plato. Plato believes that, for example, knowledge is ultimately recollection. I'm not going to get on a long aside about this, but suffice it to say that Plato believes that when you learn something, what's really happening is you're recalling something. So notice, for example, when you sit there and you talk with a child and you're going to teach them, basic math, right? 2 + 2 = 4. You show them 2 and you say, this is what I mean by 2. And then here's another instance of 2. And look, when we put these together, we have 4. And the child sees that and they recognize it. And Plato's point is if they had no concept, no ability to understand what 2 is, or what plus is, or what 4 is, you would be screwed, right? You just wouldn't be able to teach them anything. There has to be some sort of baseline recognition of the things that you're talking about. And Plato, in one of his dialogues, does this brilliantly with a slave, where he I believe it's in the Meno dialogue, where he pulls aside a slave, and he's like, he doesn't know anything about math. No, he doesn't know anything about math. Okay, good. And he starts to ask him questions about geometry, and the slave, as Plato anticipates, well, Socrates is the one talking in the dialogue, but Plato is the one who records this. So Socrates is asking him questions, and as expected, right, certain basic questions the slave gets right away. Certain other questions that he's asking, the slave gets wrong. And some of those he gets wrong, boldly wrong. And Socrates is like, but look, that's progress. You see why? Because when he boldly answered incorrectly, he thought he was right. The fact that he now sees that he's wrong actually is progress toward actual understanding. And then soon he goes on through the dialogue, and with a series of questions, the slave eventually gets to the right answer, and he just sees that is the right answer. And incidentally, I've done this with students. I've done this with children. The procedure that Socrates is doing there actually works. And Socrates' point, though, is that there's no point in that dialogue where Socrates has told the slave, you're wrong. And here's why you're wrong. Instead, once he arrives at true answers, or he exposes a false answer, the slave sees it on his own without Socrates telling him. And this is why Socrates believes that real knowledge is ultimately that the soul already knows those things. And this is why ultimately, this is the entire basis for the Socratic method. If you've ever heard this, where you engage in question and answer, is, the reason Socrates did that wasn't because he thought, well, that's just good schooling, right? It's because Socrates believed the person already knows. It's just that the soul is confused and has forgotten, and you're helping the soul recall things that are already buried within it. Now, why does Socrates think that? Well, ultimately, the reason Socrates thinks that is because of the polarity he sees within the human person. So if you look at the Phaedo dialogue, what you end up seeing is you see that Plato goes through the various arguments for the immortality of the soul. And when he's talking about the immortality of the soul, one of the arguments he talks about a polarity within reality. He points out that what we see in reality is we see certain things that are in flux and unstable. They come to be and they pass away. But then there are these other realities that seem to be stable. They don't change. Things like geometry, things like math. And so Socrates' point is there is a polarity to reality. The realm of becoming, which is what he means by things that sort of mutate and change, that come to be and pass away. And then there's the realm of being. And this is stuff that is just stable, right? The definition of a square, what a square is, doesn't change, right? What a circle is, doesn't change. Arithmetic, it doesn't change, right? These are stable realities. And what Socrates wants to ask is he makes the case that the soul has a greater affinity, this is what's called his affinity argument, that the soul has a greater affinity for those stable realities than for the unstable realities. And from here, what happens is that Socrates builds a case that the soul is ultimately immortal, right? That's one of his arguments for the immortality of the soul. And he suggests that affinity is indicative of the fact that the soul is ultimately from the world of the forms. And what Socrates believes is that the soul, being from the world of the forms, has essentially fallen into, or transmigrated, if you want to use the common sort of technical term, but we'll say fallen into matter. And in falling into matter, it's grown confused, right? It's grown confused because it's from a world of stability and structure and understanding, right? That is the nature of the soul and its native realm. Whereas finding itself now in a body, where everything is fluctuating and changing. There's flashing lights. There's chemicals rushing over it. There's all this stuff happening that puts it in constant flux, that it's become confused and it's forgotten where it's from. Now, it still draws on that, right? That's why the soul asks, like, Mommy, what is that, thing at the zoo? And then Mommy gives a name to it and so on. And the soul still applies what it remembers, right? The world of the forms, but it's confused about the fact that it thinks that this world it's looking at and interacting with is that world of the forms, not recognizing that these are just shifting shadows. And this is, of course, where, if you've ever heard of Plato's cave allegory, this is the entire point of the cave allegory. So for those who maybe have never heard this allegory, the way in which the allegory goes is that you have these men who are chained up, right? They're in a cave, and they're chained up, and they're bound, and their gaze is fixed forward at a wall. And behind them, there's a fire going, and that fire is casting light on the wall before them. And there are men back by that fire who have these sort of like cutouts of different shapes of things like animals, and they pass them before the fire, and so they cast, shadows on the wall, right? So on the wall they see the shadow of a dog or a shadow of a horse. And then the men, as they're doing that, they also make noises like barking noises or neighing noises for the horse, and the sound reverberates off of the distant wall, and so it sounds like it's coming from the shadows. And the men talk about these shadows, and they watch these stories, and they listen to them, and they feel very sophisticated in the way they get quite good at identifying what they're seeing there, and talking about the details of it and so on. But then what you have is one day you have one of these men is unchained, and then he's dragged outside of the cave, and he's dumped outside of the cave. And as he gets outside into the light, it's initially blinding. It's just like, what? He's been in a cave, for who knows how long. And all of a sudden, as his eyes begins to adjust, he looks around and he begins to see things that are in 3 dimensions, objects that are more than just shadows, objects that are substantial and concrete and stable. And then what he also begins to see is that he sees that these things are illuminated by some big flaming ball in the sky, right, that he can't even look at, but that they're providing illumination to the other things. And the entire point of the allegory is to actually suggest that this is sort of the nature of human experience. That human experience, we sort of look out into the shadowy world of fluctuation and shifting shadows and noises and things like that, and we talk about the things we encounter as if that's reality itself, right? You look out and you're like, there's a human, and there's a human, and there's a human, but that's really just a shadow of humanity as such, right? That the structure that you're actually looking at in the world has some sort of transcendent source. And what Plato is talking about here is this is, of course, the allegory, where the shadows in the wall, the noises and all of that, is indicative of the experience of the realm of becoming, of the shifting material realities. And then being outside the cave, where you see the real things, you suddenly see a real horse, you see a real dog. That is, in this allegory, those would be the forms, right? That's the substantial or real thing that the shadow is just sort of a vague representation of. And then, of course, the sun is the good, or God, from whom, who illuminates the forms. That's a longer discussion. But suffice it to say, the reason this is there in Plato is that what Plato wants to suggest is exactly that, that the soul is from the realm of the forms. It knows the forms because that's its native realm, but having fallen into this sort of shadowy and confused state, it ends up being confused. It draws on its recollection of the forms, but it's forgotten where it's from, and there's a certain polarity. Now, the other aspect of Plato's anthropology that is really important is also the idea that the soul is immortal. Now, the reason this is important is because when you actually look at his case for the immortality of the soul, and again, he has multiple arguments for the immortality of the soul throughout the Phaedo. But one of the things that's interesting when you look at the case that he makes elsewhere, and I think it's in the Meno dialogue actually, where he's making the case for recollection, one of the things that he talks about in that dialogue is that he suggests that once you follow the argument, what's interesting is he gets to the idea, he starts to talk about the idea that the soul is the life of the body. And he's talking about what's essentially the distinction between accidental and essential properties. And I've talked about this before, right? It's essential to a square that it has four sides. It's accidental that it's blue or that it's 3 feet wide, something like that. That's essential versus accidental properties. And so when you're talking about accidental properties, you're talking about things that are transient, things that you can sort of modify without changing what the thing is. And so, for example, you can be a different height and still be human. The square could be in a different location and still be human. But what Plato ultimately argues, or Socrates ultimately argues, is that once you follow the idea that the soul is the life of the body, which this just, by the way, was the basic understanding in the ancient world. When you're talking about the soul, what are you talking about? You're talking about the life force of a body, right? And I feel like I should probably do a small aside here on this very fact. The basic understanding is that it makes sense to talk about a dead body precisely because the life of the body and the body itself are distinct. There's a logical distinction between those. And so there is a time when bodies are alive, and then you have the body and life within it, and then there are times when that life departs. And the question is, does that life, that's the distinction between body and soul, right? The animating force of the body and the body that is animated. That was the distinction. That's also incidentally why they thought plants had souls, why they thought animals had souls, and why they thought man had souls. That's not to say all those things are rational. Reason is something different. But it is to say that they are all living bodies. So they all have a life force or a soul. And the question was, when that life departs, does it continue or does it cease to be, right? That was the question. And one of the arguments that Socrates makes when talking about the immortality of the soul is he suggests that the soul would need to have life as an accidental property. And he builds the case that suggests that's incoherent. It makes sense to talk about a dead body. It doesn't make sense to talk about a dead or a lifeless soul. That gets you into the sorts of contradictions on par with a square without four sides. And for that reason, what Plato or Socrates ends up suggesting is that life is an essential property of soul, and that's why it has to be immortal. Now, if you follow his argument, though, what's interesting is that Socrates ultimately is arguing that the soul doesn't just continue to exist after its creation, but rather he suggests that it necessarily exists and lives. That's what he's ultimately arguing. So when you follow this particular argument for the immortality of the soul, in Socrates, what you end up is the case for aseity, or self-existence. That's the attribute that's sometimes assigned to God. And so for it's no surprise, once Socrates comes to this conclusion that two things happen. The one is that Socrates concludes not only that the soul must survive death, but it must precede its existence within the body. And this is part of what provides rational force to the claim that the soul is from the world of the forms, that it existed before landing in a body and that it continues to exist after it leaves the body. That's one of the things that ultimately results from this. another thing that results is you have the more explicit case moving into like Middle and Neoplatonists, that ultimately the soul is divine, that it is a spark of God that ends up trapped in a material house or something like that. And so the point here, though, is to actually suggest that exactly that in this anthropology, the soul is something that precedes landing in the body, is from a different world. That's why it recognizes that world. That's why it longs for that world. And yet it lands here in a chaotic, unstable material principle. It ends up confused and disoriented. And so much of liberation ultimately has to do with it reorienting itself back toward the world of the forms. This, incidentally, is also why Socrates ultimately ends up landing on the side of reincarnation. So what he suggests is that the soul ultimately goes through these cycles where it falls into a body, it ends up reorienting and then liberating from the body. And the question is whether or not it has made itself suitable to join the company of the gods. And if not, it returns to a body, right? And so you end up with this something that's almost like Hinduism, where the idea is that the soul falls into the body, it leaves the body. If it's not suitable to join the company of the gods, if it hasn't attained virtue and things like that, then it will return back to a body and do it all over again. And so that's the anthropology you end up getting with that form of metaphysical dualism. Now, notice that in all of these forms of metaphysical dualism, one of the things that you have is ultimately a belief in the afterlife, right? The idea that somehow there's a polarity here that has to do with liberation from the body into an afterlife, and in all such cases, that liberation ultimately leaves behind the body, right? So if you were to tell Socrates that God is going to raise the dead and take virtuous souls and put them back into a body, that would be horrifying to Socrates, right? The body is part of the problem here. And the same thing would be true for the other forms of metaphysical dualists, right? When you're looking at Gnostics and Manichaeis, the entire message of salvation, the hope of the mystery cult, is that by attaining this secret knowledge that we're offering to you, you can ultimately be liberated from the evil principle that is the body. So in all cases, this anthropology drives them toward the conclusion that true salvation, the truest form of the self, is ultimately the soul liberated from the body. And this is an interesting point because when you look at modernity, and we'll get there, one of the things that's oftentimes talked about in modernity is somebody like Descartes, who again we'll talk about, is typically the one who is blamed for the idea that the person is ultimately just a rational mind, that it's just a soul. Or if you were using the more ancient term, a spirit, right? That the spirit is ultimately the real self, like that's the true itself, and then the body is in some ways something that extends in space. And Descartes, because of his meditations and certain things that arise out of that related to his rationalism, that sometimes, in common narratives about the history of ideas, it's identified as sort of a modern turn, something that emerges with Descartes. But I actually find that difficult to lay at the feet of Descartes, given that what you have within the metaphysical dualists of the ancient world is something quite similar. When you're actually saying that the person is liberated from the body, you are excluding the body from the person, right? The person is ultimately the soul on this view. And ultimately what you're saying is that the body is not only something that is just an appendage, but you're saying it's a dispensable appendage. And in fact, it is desirable to dispense with it. So when looking at that, I would say that the metaphysical dualists already have the notion that the true self, that the person is ultimately the soul. And specifically when you're talking about rational beings, the spirit, right, the rational part of the soul. Just so people aren't confused here, I'll just point out, In the ancient world, soul referred to, as I pointed out, the life force of a body. This is why plants have a soul, animals have a soul, man has a soul. Spirit was the term used for pure intelligences. This is one of the reasons why you have angels are referred to as spirits, not as souls, and then God is referred to as a spirit. The reason with man sometimes you get this weird interchange where the words spirit and soul are both used is because man is an animal, so he has an animated body, which means that he has a soul. But this soul, its purest part, is that it has reason. And this is why it is also referred to, this particular soul is also referred to as a spirit. And so, anyway, we can, I don't know if we'll talk more about that, but that at least gives you a baseline for understanding the language being used here. Anyway, so returning to anthropology, that's why I have trouble laying that at the feet of Descartes as some sort of modern innovation. Clearly within metaphysical dualism, you have a distinction between body and soul, such that the body is not even really part of the person. It is an awkward appendage that at best confuses the person or the soul, and at worst drags it into evil because it's actually evil. And of course, how the person is then seen ends up being reflected in the ethics of these two groups, right? With Gnostics and Manichaeists, there's a tendency to see evil as relegated to the body because ultimately it's just an extension of that evil principle, right? Those evil impulses, right, are just sort of rooted in that materiality, and ultimately salvation has to do with just the liberation of the soul from that by way of a secret knowledge. Whereas with somebody like Socrates, where what's going on is that the body is actually sort of chaotic and unstable and confuses the soul, one of the concerns that somebody like Socrates or Plato has is actually it goes to this point of affinity, that by awakening the soul, by having it turn its gaze away from the lower things that drag it deeper into the material realm and turn its gaze toward those things that provide order, toward the forms, to begin to rightly order things and order the self in accord with virtue, in accord with the forms, cultivating the pagan virtues of justice and of wisdom and of temperance and of courage, then the soul begins to make itself suitably sort of ascend, as it were, in some ways, to the realm of the forms and lean into that affinity, as it were, and make itself suitable to join the ranks of the gods. And so the anthropology ends up naturally playing its way out in terms of ethics. Now, contrast this, I suppose, with what we could offer as the best sort of corollary for a purely materialist anthropology. And this would be the sort of thing you find in the Epicureans. So the Epicureans are sort of odd within the ancient world, specifically because they were pegged as atheists. Now, there's an entire body of literature on whether or not this is fair. And I understand. Epicurus does not seem to be a hard-bitten atheist. He does seem to be more agnostic about the gods. But ultimately, one of the things that made the Epicureans stand out is that really all of the pagan philosophers had come around to the position that there is such a thing as providence, or the idea that the world is in some ways ordered by some grand mind. Some called it the logos, some called it nous, right? But the point was that the majority opinion had gone in the direction of saying there is order to the world that is indicative of all of this in some ways being ordered and cared for by something like a mind. And the Epicureans were the ones who ended up taking the position that all things are composed of just random atomic matter. And yes, they did believe in atoms. These are the ancient atomists, where they thought all things are composed of small bits of stuff. Now, their concept of atom was pretty basic, right? Like really, really small pellets, almost is kind of how they think about it. But the point was that they really did think things were sort of chaotic happenstance. And with that, what you find is you also find that, lo and behold, they do believe in the soul. They acknowledge the distinction between the life force of a body and the body itself. They acknowledge that there is a logical distinction there. But you find in people, like Epicurus, that they think the soul, too, must be composed of atoms. And yet, from their philosophy because they think, well, there's a certain sense in which all things are immortal. That's actually a key premise of the atomists. They think nothing comes to be and passes away because all things are just composed of atoms, and coming to be and passing away is just rearrangement. They ultimately were fine with saying that the soul too can sort of disperse, right? The atoms of the soul can disperse and be rearranged into other things. And so for this reason, you have no commitment to immortality, to an afterlife, to those sorts of things, or even to providence. And at the end of the day, what you get, this is the closest thing you get to an ethics that is purely subjective. Because things are not ordered by providence, you end up having the commitment to the idea that what we mean by good and evil is really just pleasure and pain. Now, this, I think, is your early example of the fact that, again, the worldview ends up informing how you approach these things. For people like Socrates, and even for a metaphysical dualist like Empedocles, you actually do have ordering principles. When you talk about the order of the cosmos, you're not talking about happenstance. You're not talking about projection that we are imposing on the world to sort of invent an order that's not there. It's not a mental fiction. Those of you who listen to me regularly and have heard me talk about realism and nominalism, you can see probably right here that realism and nominalism are right there at the get-go in this discussion. You have one group who is basically, which is the majority opinion amongst the pagan philosophers, that suggests that when we look out into the world and we see order, we see distinctions between genera and species, and we see common properties, and we see categories and structure. Those are things that are really out there, as it were, part of the world. They are real. And yet you have here with the Epicureans where they suggest, no, they don't believe in providence. They don't believe that the atoms are ordered by some divine principle of mind. And for that reason, the coalescence of atoms into different stuff is really just sort of chaotic happenstance. That's incidentally one of the reasons why so few people embraced atomism. Atomism was looked at as really sort of implausible because you're looking at it going, really? All of this stuff is just sort of like chaotic, random happenstance that it coalesces. It happens to coalesce in the same types of things over and over again and in ways that are indicative of structure. It was viewed with a great deal of skepticism. But what you end up having here is because the one group believes that there actually is a real structure and order to the world, somebody like Socrates wants to suggest that you actually can, in discerning the order and the nature of things, you can also discern what is man and what is a properly ordered man. And in this sense, reality itself will tell you something about what you are and how you ought to live, and then you should conform to reality. This is an objective form of morality that begins to emerge. And as I said, because of Plato's understanding of the affinity argument, for example, conforming oneself to the proper order, to the forms, is key to what the good life is and ultimately to the liberation of the soul. In the case of the Epicureans, however, because they think it's all random, chaotic happenstance, they end up taking the position that says, well, by good and evil, what we really mean is pleasure and pain. And this is the earliest form of hedonism. That's actually the form of ethics that emerges here, where everything about Epicureanism has to do with the fact that what we mean by good is things that we like and find pleasurable. What we mean by things that are evil, we mean things that we find undesirable and unpleasant. So on the one hand, it provides broad brushstrokes, right? You shouldn't engage in, maybe taking heroin that gives you a really high high because it comes with really low lows. It comes with a certain amount of pain. And so there was a recognition within Epicureanism, it's a hard word to say, that certain highs carry certain lows. And so you need to, when considering a course of action, you really need to consider, what are the consequences of that action? Because if the goal is to sort of maximize pleasure and minimize pain, you need to take into account these sort of long-term ramifications of the choice. But what you end up with is a very sort of subjective ethics, right? Because what happens is it's not suggesting that the properly ordered man lives this way or looks this way or something something like that. There's a certain subjective side to this that suggests that what you find pleasurable, what you find painful, is in some ways a matter of your own sort of taste or judgment. And in this sense, the broad guidelines are that, look, what you really want, what we're all pursuing when we talk about happiness, when we're looking for happiness, we're ultimately looking for something like pleasure. That's what we mean, a generally pleasant state of affairs. And so when talking about what the good life is and the type of life you should lead, surely we don't mean ought in the sense of it conforms to a sort of grand rational scheme of nature, or to your place within that grand rational scheme of nature. What we really mean is a generally pleasant and enjoyable mode of existence. And so in this sense, wisdom, as we use this term, would ultimately just mean making sound judgments about how to live a generally pleasant life that is relatively stress-free, that delivers a certain amount of pleasure, and avoids really sort of like dramatic dips and things like that. You don't want the roller coaster ride of life. That would be problematic. Now, this is a key fork in the road when it comes to anthropology and ethics. A lot of people today, I use the word happiness, and happiness was critical. It was a central term within ancient philosophy, and a relatively uncontroversial, I would say actually probably the least controversial premise in the history of philosophy is that everybody wants to be happy, that happiness is what drives people. Now, where the philosophical controversy emerges, and incidentally, just if you're like, come on, that's not very Christian, Thomas Aquinas says the same thing, and he says it because the philosopher, by whom he means Aristotle, says that. So this was true even within Christian philosophy. The dispute was not whether or not people desire happiness. The dispute was what was meant by happiness and what is the relationship between happiness and pleasure. Okay, so one of the questions you might just ask when digging into this question is just to say, well, is pleasure and happiness interchangeable? Are those synonyms? Are they the same thing? Do those terms refer to the same object? Are we talking about the same thing when we say pleasure and happiness? Now, a little bit of reflection should say, no, I don't think so, because I'm pretty sure that when somebody is shooting heroin or something like that and experiencing pleasure, but they are miserable, that they're not happy. There's a show that I thought I don't think it's on anymore, but I thought it always illustrated this so well. And this was the show Intervention. So the show Intervention was, every episode was pretty much the same, where what you would start, the structure, was that you would meet somebody, right? You'd meet somebody who's addicted to something. And it could be, it could be that they're an alcoholic, could be heroin, meth, whatever, right? They're addicted to something and they're destroying their lives. And you meet their family who's beside themselves, and at some point you have an intervention. And then the intervention, they're being offered an opportunity to get clean and to take their life in a new direction. And what was interesting to me about this is that throughout the entire show, in the one-on-one interviews, the person who's addicted is always saying, like, yeah, I'm miserable. I'd be better off dead. Inevitably, if I keep doing this, I'm going to kill myself, right? Like, it was always so bleak. And then when the family would intervene, they would be like, ugh, I'm so offended that you would come to me and suggest that I should get cleaned up. It was always such a weird polarity. I would always talk about this with students when I would talk about the phenomenon of hell and the idea that hell is locked from the inside, because it's such a perfect illustration of that. Somebody who's like, I'm miserable, and yet the idea of change is offensive to me. Anyway, but that's not my point here. My point here is that illustrates quite well that somebody can chase pleasure without actually arriving at happiness. So once you observe that, now you're into, okay, we can separate. We can say that happiness and pleasure are not the same thing. They are not identical. But now you face a different sort of question, which is can you have happiness without any amount of pleasure? And this is where you get into a new controversy. So on the one hand, within the ancient world, basically you find this spectrum Where on the one hand you have hedonists, like the Epicureans, who really are equating pleasure and happiness. On the other hand, on the far side, you would find Stoics, who we haven't talked about yet, but suffice it to say that the Stoics actually do seem to lean in the direction of saying that you could have happiness without having pleasure. And so they create a strict divide. But then you have other people like Aristotle who suggest that virtue is an essential feature of the happy life. And Aristotle acknowledges that the path to virtue can be difficult and it can lack pleasure, but he suggests that ultimately it has to arrive at a place, if you're really going to be virtuous, it has to arrive at a place where you take some pleasure in being virtuous. And unless you get there, you haven't really arrived at the happy life. He thinks you need to have both of those. And so you might think of it like learning to play piano, right? There's a certain drudgery to learning to play the piano. But once you get proficient at it, you can begin to enjoy it. And that's kind of what Aristotle sees with regard to virtue. Virtue might begin with that sort of drudgery, but at some point when you become proficient in it, you need to actually start to delight in it and take pleasure in it. And that's where the merger of that sort of drudgery and pleasure end up both come into play in the happy life. So anyway, you find that sort of spectrum. But I think this is a really critical feature of what you begin to see within the ways in which worldview plays out within the intersection between worldview and anthropology. The very fact that you have, from the one side, you have folks who are believers in providence. They believe that there is a certain structure to reality, and that objective structure means that I have a certain place within the cosmos, and understanding and discerning that place, and me coming into conformity with reality is central to me becoming good, and that goodness is tied with the thing that I desire, which is happiness. And on the other hand, you see over here with the Epicureans, there is no providence. For that reason, there is no objective order. And for that reason, there is no objective order for me to conform to. And instead, happiness and the pursuit of happiness becomes a subjective enterprise where I'm exploring the best ways to balance pleasure and pain in order to get to a generally pleasant state of existence. That's sort of the fork in the road that you see there with regard to the connection between worldview, anthropology, ethics, and ultimately the aim of ethics, which is the happy life. Okay. Now, we've started to touch on some other anthropology. So we really started with this metaphysical dualism side of things. We contrasted that, of course, with the pure atomistic, hedonistic side of things. And then we talked about Plato, who on the one hand is a dualist of sorts, but has a sort of more moderate view of the duality that's there, matter being more sort of a pesky and resistant recipient of form more so than a malevolent force within the world. But you do have these other anthropologies. Let's just continue on with these pagans for a minute, even though these run in parallel with the Christians, who we'll talk about soon enough. But you have a couple of other anthropologies that begin to play out. On the one hand, we could delve into the details of Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, but given that we're just doing an overview, I'm going to suggest that the Middle and Neoplatonism really is a proper reception of Plato. And so even though there's definitely some ways in which this Neo and Middle Platonism ends up playing out and trying to systematize what Plato's thinking and begins to articulate in certain ways that Plato did not so explicitly articulate the ramifications of his views. For example, that the soul is a divine spark, for example, or that the forms are the ideas of God or something like that, that they are in some ways they are emanated from God as the content of the divine mind. We could go into those sorts of nuances, but I'm going to suggest that in terms of the broad sort of brushstrokes of anthropology, we've kind of already covered the basic anthropology of the Platonists and how that plays out in the realm of ethics. And so let's just sort of zero in instead on a couple of other alternatives here. And here I have in mind people like Aristotle and people like the Stoics, who we just touched on when talking about happiness. Now, I actually want to start with the Stoics. I find the Stoics rather fascinating, and they offer a great deal of insight on the realm of ethics and things like that. But let's just start with a feature of their worldview that is probably one of the more repugnant features. I mean, by repugnant, I'm not trying to stack the deck and say it's obviously wrong. There are many things about the world that are true that strike us as horrifying. But I'll just sort of focus in on this one feature of Stoicism that many people today would probably recoil from. That's what I mean by repugnance. And that recoiling is from the notion of fate. So the Stoics are fatalists. Now, once again, this commitment to fate is in many ways just an extension of their underlying metaphysics. So I'd mentioned that amongst the pagans, there is this belief, the dominant belief, as contrasted with the Epicureans, is a belief in providence, that the world is somehow ordered by something like a mind. And in being ordered by something like a mind, that mind gives to it structures and categories, and those include not only the nature of things, but the purpose or the end or the telos of things. And the Stoics are certainly of this school of thought. They are definitely believers in providence. So like the others who think this way, they refer to this as the divine logos, right? This word or this logic, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, but this word that orders all things. They were advocates of that. Not everybody used that term. As I said, some use nous. They refer to the mind that orders all things. As I said, Empedocles uses love, right? That's the term that he uses. But the Stoics use the term logos when trying to identify this rational principle of nature. Now, one of the things, though, that the Stoics advocate is actually pantheism. And so this is a rather interesting feature of their thought. They really do believe that in many ways, actually, I shouldn't even qualify that in many ways. They just believe that the world is a giant divine organism. So it's interesting when you look at the Stoics, what you find is that they have several names for God, right? They will refer to the Logos. They will also refer to Zeus, right? But one of the terms they also use for God is cosmos, right? And this is because what they understand is they understand the world to go through these sort of cosmic cycles, where what you have is you have the original divine fire. And this is a common thing within the ancient world, where fire is oftentimes used as one of the metaphors or the elements oftentimes identified with the divine. And so talk about this original primordial divine fire. And then what you have is you have the different categories or properties that begin to differentiate things, according to the Stoics, are really the logic of God differentiating God's own substance. So the introduction of difference is really an introduction of properties and differentiation in the divine substance itself. And this is why you get pantheism, right? The idea that what's ultimately happening is that the world is God, right? God is the underlying substance of the world. Matter, that substratum from which all things arise, is ultimately divine. It's not a second principle. Now, the reason this creates a form of fate, and I actually talk about this in my Leibniz book, which just came out August 1st. And in one of the chapters there where I talk about sort of antecedents to Leibniz's thought in pagan and in Christian thought, one of the things that I point out is that the Stoics actually do believe in a sort of repetitive history. The idea being that what's happening in the articulation, in the divine self-articulation, is because what's happening is God is articulating his own wisdom in the introduction of properties into the divine substance. Inevitably what happens is history always plays out in the same way. They really are advocates of, well, the idea that our world is the best possible world. And if anything were different, then that would indicate that God himself would be different, and that would indicate that he could be better than he is or worse than he is, which is impossible. So you have these sort of repeated cosmic histories, or at least that's something advocated by certain Stoics. But this naturally begins to play out in the idea of fate, right? The idea that there is something being orchestrated about the world and the events in the world in which we are trapped, we might say, or of which we are part. And so the very sort of pagan notion that the gods weave before the throne of Zeus the things that should happen to us, and those things must just happen, well, the Stoics are advocates of that sort of thing. Now, you might wonder, now, wait a second, Dr. Jacobs, I'm pretty sure I remember hearing once upon a time something about Stoic ethics. How do you even have ethics if you have something like fate? Because wouldn't fate indicate that we don't have free will? And if we don't have free will, how are we morally responsible? And what is the point of even talking about ethics? Well, if you're thinking that, that's a very good question. And this is actually really sort of a key feature of Stoic ethics. Fatalism actually factors into it heavily, because what the Stoics do suggest, and you can see this in certain people like Epicurus, in his writings, what you end up seeing is that he suggests that even though all of this stuff is fated, even though it's all woven before the throne of Zeus by the fates, so to speak. He actually, I think he actually does use that reference in his writings and his discourses. But even though that is true, right, there is one thing about the world that God has entrusted to the creature, and that is free will. And so Epicurus actually does say that, like a wise, caretaker, he's entrusted to man, this one thing that not even he can control. Now, you might naturally think, well, how on earth could fate, and free will possibly coincide? Because it sounds like fate is utterly contrary to free will. And this is an important nuance, right? I don't want to get sidetracked with the discussion of determinism. We do have an entire episode on free will where you can hear me talk about determinism, things like that. But determinism is contrary to free will. I am an advocate of that view, that determinism would mean that I don't have the power of contrary choice. But for the Stoics, you do have the power of contrary choice, but you're still fated. How? Well, think about the story of Oedipus, right? So in the story of Oedipus, obviously you have a number of characters who are taking very specific action to try to avoid the outcome that the oracles have said, is going to happen, right? That has been woven for this character. They're trying to evade this fate that Oedipus will end up killing his father and marrying his mother. And yet, the very actions that they end up taking are the actions that lead to that outcome. And this is actually one of the things that you see within Stoic ethics. Stoic ethics is very much in favor of the idea that, look, if the gods want you on the island of Crete, they're going to get you to the island of Crete. However, the story of how you make it to Crete may look different. And here the insistence is that there is one version of the story where you recognize that the gods want me in Crete, and even though I don't want to go to Crete, I am going to align my will with their will, and I'm going to go to Crete anyway. I want what the gods want, even when they want something contrary to my sort of natural desires. That is one version of the story. Now, the other version of the story is I say, no, I'm going to defy the gods, and I am going to race in the opposite direction. And then you're still going to end up in Crete, but the story will look different. It might look more like Jonah, for example. But this is how the Stoics reconcile fate and free will. And this becomes the core of Stoic ethics, because at the end of the day, the Stoics want to suggest that the pocket of the world you can control is not the outcomes. You can't control whether or not you're going to end up in Crete, because if the gods want you in Crete, by gum, you're going to get to Crete. What you can control is whether or not you resist the gods, whether you resist the logos, or whether you recognize your place within the world and submit to it. And that really is the basis of Stoic ethics. So much of Stoicism, obviously, if you've heard of Stoicism, if you've brushed up against it, you're probably familiar with this idea of apatheia, right, or of apathy, that this person is very stoic. And people tend to think of this as being unfeeling or something like that you are just sort of like a stoic, a cold stone slab that feels nothing. That's actually not true for Stoicism, incidentally, and I'll get back to that when we talk about the anthropology of it in a second. The Stoics really do believe, they talk about like good and bad emotions. They do have emotion as part of their anthropology. But what the Stoics really do believe is they really do believe that there's something inherently irrational about trying to resist the gods. Okay, so this fits into that same sort of, remember how I talked about a little bit ago, I was talking about this idea of a very objective morality, where the world is a certain way, and I fit into the world in a certain way, and the best way to figure out what the good life is and ethics is to discern the nature of the world and where I fit into it, and then I align my will in accord with that objective reality. And the contrast, of course, is something much more subjective. There is no such thing as providence. There is no such thing as objective ethics. And as a result, there's only sort of the pursuit of pleasure and pain, which does have a subjective element to it. Well, the Stoics are certainly of the objective ethics sort. They are advocates of natural law. And so a lot of people, when they think of natural law, they naturally think of Thomas Aquinas. And yeah, Thomas Aquinas is an advocate of natural law of a certain kind. But natural law certainly predates Thomas Aquinas, and you see it within the Stoics. The Stoics are big advocates of natural law, where you discern the order of nature, and in discerning the order of nature, you begin to see the proper end of things, what a thing is, why it is, for what purpose, and then in discerning the order of things, you operate in accord with the purpose, right? So the idea for the Stoics is that they would suggest that good refers to a thing being properly formed and operating in accord with its place within nature. Evil, by contrast, is a divergence from that. Well, as people who believe that you and I are subordinate to the gods, and especially to the logos itself, it becomes irrational. It becomes an irrational act to try to resist that fact. And so for this reason, this is why fate ends up informing their ethics so potently. Because ultimately, when talking about that, really at the end of the day, natural law is about the order and the nature of things and operating in accord with the order of nature. One of the key things to understand about yourself is that you are not God, and that you are subordinate to God and to the gods. And for that reason, the best thing for you to do is to recognize that fact and operate in accord with it. So there's something inherently irrational and contrary to the order of nature about you saying, yes, I know the gods want this for me, or yes, I know that they have ordained this for me, but I resist and defy them. That's actually not courage, right? That is an act of hubris, right? It's something where it is the root of courage, but it's devoid of wisdom because it's contrary to the order of nature. So what does ethics begin to look like? Well, the key to ethics here, Stoic ethics, is actually the recognition that what you and I experience is a certain duality. And now we're back to the duality we talked about at the beginning of this episode. And the duality they talk about is the fact that we are, on the one hand, rational spiritual beings, right? We have this rational mind. So we have a soul or spirit. And yet at the same time, we have an animal body. And having an animal body, we also have passions, right? And these passions, as we've talked about in other contexts, specifically usually when talking about the Eastern Church Fathers, but the Stoics talk about them as well. The passions are basically these pre-volitional responses to external stimuli. So if you are walking to a room and you smell somebody cooking pizza, you have a natural sort of draw or desire for it, right? It draws you in prior to any act of will, right? If you see an attractive person, you might be drawn to them prior to any act of will. If you turn and look and you see there's a snake in the room, right? You might suddenly jump back and recoil prior to any act of will. In other words, you perceive a thing, and in perceiving it being either good or bad, you either incline toward or you recoil from it. Those are the passions, and that's prior to an act of will. And so this is what the Stoics refer to as propathia, meaning this first movement of a passion, right? A pre-volitional movement of the passion. Now, the Stoics would be of the camp, unlike the metaphysical dualists, more like what we talked about with Empedocles, they would be of the camp that says, well, the passions are just animal. And being just animal, they're actually not morally good or bad. So morality is something that concerns rational beings, beings that are able to discern the order of nature and choose to operate in accord with it or contrary to it. Dogs don't do that, right? So dogs are neither virtuous nor vicious. They're just dogs. And this is where the Stoics talk about things being good, virtuous, vicious, or neutral. And the dog, the animal, would be in this neutral territory. It lacks the necessary properties to rise to a moral level. So it has no moral properties. And for this reason, what they would say about that propathia, it being pre-volitional, it is not yet something moral. And this goes to something that I've talked about. I've talked about this often in the context of the church fathers. But I've talked about that every person recognizes intuitively, you and I and the child in kindergarten, that we could just grab at random and be like, hey, do you know this? And the answer would be they do. That there are two things that are required for moral culpability to adhere. You need to know what you ought to do or ought not to do, and you have to have the ability to do it or not do it. And this is one of the reasons why whenever a child is caught doing something wrong, their defense is either to lie and deny reality, but if they are caught red-handed, it's either I didn't know or I couldn't help it. And the reason we all intuitively go there, and we still go there, officer, I didn't see the speed limit sign, right? I didn't know I couldn't help it continues to be our mode of defense, even when it gets more sophisticated. The reason we go there is because we intuitively recognize that in order to be held morally responsible, we have to know what we ought or ought not to do, and we have to have the ability to do it or not do it. And the Stoics recognize this as well. And recognizing this, they recognize that propathia, that first movement of the passions, is actually morally neutral. There are no moral properties yet, specifically because it's pre-volitional, right? Prior to an act of will. Now, this is where you get into apatheia, right? So the Stoics want to suggest that what happens next is that if that movement of the passions is in accord with nature and the will engages, you now have something good and appropriate. It is eupatheia, right? It is a good emotion. It's in accord with nature. But let's say that that movement of the passions is contrary to the order of nature. You're attracted to somebody and they are not your wife. It's somebody who you shouldn't be, engaged with in a sexual manner, and you end up acting on that. You are now engaged in pathos, meaning you've engaged in a passion that is contrary to the order of nature, right? And so that's the fork in the road. And apatheia refers to not that you feel nothing, right? Keep in mind, they talk about good emotions. Apatheia refers to the capacity to experience propathia, to experience the movement of a passion and not immediately translate it into action. To experience it and to be able to pause and assess, is it in accord with the order of nature or contrary to it? And if it's in accord with nature, you act on it. If it's contrary to it, you reject it. That's what apatheia is. And so Stoic ethics is all about that. Now, in keeping with this, that fork in the road that I talked about between good emotions and bad emotions also goes to whether it is rational or irrational. And this is where a lot of what you find within Stoic ethics is you find a lot in there about it being irrational, for example, to grieve. This is actually a point of difference that you find between the Stoics and the Jewish and then Christian echoes of Stoicism. A lot of Alexandrian Jews like Philo of Alexandria end up echoing a lot of Stoic ethics, as does St. James in the New Testament, as do the Eastern Church Fathers. And yet, you see this certain divergence from the Stoics on certain things. For example, Paul actually commands you. He suggests that it's actually a rational thing for you to mourn with those who mourn. Whereas the Stoics were like, mourning is actually in some ways an indictment of the will of the gods, right? And so their fatalism ends up informing how they assess the order of nature. So it's interesting that with the Stoics, again, you see this sort of framework where on the one hand, they have an objective ethic. That objective ethic ends up leading to a certain form of natural law. But because the worldview ultimately moves toward this form of pantheism, and in this form of pantheism, what you have is a form of fatalism. That fatalism ends up affecting how it is that they see what constitutes a rational or an irrational act. I'll give you another example. Suicide. Obviously, Judaism and Christianity were both wildly opposed to killing oneself, right? Suicide was immediately off the table and considered repugnant, a form of murder. And yet, with the Stoics, you have stories of Stoics who believe that if the gods have ordained for you to die, it's rational for you to kill yourself. That's actually the rational thing to do. And you actually do have instances, right? You have stories of this. I think it's Zeno of Citium. Is that who it is? I might be confusing him with somebody else. Anyway, you have stories of Stoics who ultimately do receive a sign, right? They would look for signs. This is where the Stoics actually did believe in divine revelation, oracles and signs and things like that. And if you receive a sign that the gods want you dead, then rather than waiting for them to kill you in whatever creative fashion they might come up with, it would be rational for you to off yourself. Obviously, the Jews and the Christians disagreed with that, but that's a natural extension of the Stoic worldview, of their pantheism and ultimately fatalism that's paired then with this natural law. Now, I had noted that when starting in on the Stoics, I noted that the Stoics were a group that sort of stood apart from the typical dualism, right? So rather than having two warring principles, a good and evil principle, or even identifying matter as a second principle distinct from God that is somehow inherently unstable and is the explanation for corruption and things like that, what you had with the Stoics is ultimately, with the Stoics, what you saw was that as pantheists, they tended to actually see a certain unity to reality. And in this sense, what you see is you actually see with the Stoics a certain echo of Heraclitus. And candidly, I see the Stoics echo Heraclitus quite a bit. I mean, obviously, they're echoing his language of the Logos. They echo his language of the divine fire. And they also echo the language that the world is properly ordered. And from the divine perspective, all things are purposive. And this is part of the reason for their advocacy of optimism, right? The idea that our world is the best possible world. Now, obviously, the Stoics are introducing the idea that we can do wicked things, right? That we can operate in an irrational way, contrary to the order of nature. And so this is where they're introducing the idea that we, as rational beings, sort of mirroring the divine, ultimately do have within our power a certain ability to actually operate in accord with the order of nature or not. So in this sense, they are of that mind that will be echoed in the Christians, that free will is central to the things that go awry in creation. However, the Stoics are also of the mind that many of the things that we identify as unpleasant and evils are ultimately from the divine perspective meant for good or meant for the formation of virtue and things like this. And so in this sense, they are very much, they're not suggesting that evil is an illusion, but they would suggest that many of the things we identify as evil are actually unpleasantries and from the divine perspective are introduced by the order of providence for our good, for our formation in virtue and conformity to the order of nature. Now, another anthropology that we might identify also outside of the sort of dualistic tendency is actually Aristotle. And so anybody who is familiar with Raphael's School of Athens is familiar with that centerpiece, right, where you have at the center of the painting both Plato and Aristotle, and they're in dialogue right there at the middle of the School of Athens. And what you see, if you're familiar with this painting, is you see Plato pointing up, right, to the sky. And you see Aristotle reaching his hand out and extending it and pointing to, gesturing to the world around us. And this is Raphael's way of trying to capture the difference between Plato and his most famous student, Aristotle. And the difference has to do with where they identify the order of nature, where they identify the forms. So those of you who have listened to me for any number of times, right, I've already touched on this realism, right? The idea that there's this fork in the road between realism and nominalism. Realism being the view that when we look out into the order of nature and we see genera and species and common properties and categories, that the mind is not inventing those or imposing those on the world. The mind is actually identifying and abstracting something that's really there. Now, if we think back on what we already said about Plato, you'll recall that when we talked about this, Plato's narrative, specifically in the Timaeus, this is where this comes out of, but they are echoed in other places. Plato understands there to be a second world, right? That there is, at least this is the traditional reading of Plato, and certainly the reading of his student Aristotle, that our world is a material copy. And that material copy is a copy of the world of the forms, right? The archetypes, these perfect ideals. And so this is the thing that I talked about, where I had suggested that according to Plato, the demiurge is there contemplating the forms, and then he looks at this second principle of matter, which is disordered and chaotic, and he begins to shape it and craft it to mirror in some ways the forms, right? And I talked about, obviously, in the context of anthropology, that our soul is from the world of the forms. It has greater affinity with that world, and that's why it knows the forms and brings that remembrance, that knowledge into our world as it begins to look out into the shifting shadows of matter. Now, that view is what Raphael is trying to capture when he has Plato pointing up, right? Because he's saying the forms up there, that second world of ideals that our world is a shadow of, right? That's what Raphael is trying to capture there. Whereas what you have by contrast with Aristotle is you have Aristotle pointing to our world and saying the forms. So this goes to a distinction that is sometimes referred to as the distinction between extreme realism and moderate realism. So realism is the view that when we look out into the world and we see these structures, the mind is not inventing those. Those aren't mental fictions. Those are real. The mind is identifying a real feature of the world. These are part of the structures of reality. That's why it's called realism. Now, Plato's view, though, is sometimes called extreme realism, and the reason it's called extreme realism because Plato, at least again traditionally read according to his student Aristotle, that Plato believes that these structures are so real that they are concrete realities that compose a different world, right? That there is some sort of world composed of the archetype of circle and sphere and line and number and dog and cat and man and so on. That's at least how Plato is read by his student. And so that makes these structures not only real, but in some ways concrete, a second world. And that's what is extreme about it, Plato pointing up the forms. Now, the contrast is what is sometimes called moderate realism. And the moderate realism is the view that's sometimes identified with Aristotle. And moderate realism suggests that, no, look, the structures are real, right? When we talk about the form of man, that's not a mental invention where we just sort of cordon off a certain group and come up with some sort of name and definition that we impose on the world. No. When you look out and you say that's a man and that's a dog, you are identifying very real distinctions. There is a different nature that one has that is distinct from that one. This one that we call man has a certain set of essential properties, and everyone who has that nature has those essential properties. Like, you really are identifying something that's real. But Aristotle doesn't think the forms or those structures exist someplace else outside of the world. Rather, Aristotle thinks those structures, those formal properties, as well as the teleology that they entail, right, the eye for seeing, are in matter. And so how I've sometimes tried to illustrate this is that I've taken, and if I were here doing a visual podcast as opposed to this one being purely auditory, I would do it again for you. But I would take a piece of fabric and I'd say, look, this piece of fabric is generally speaking structureless, right? It's potentially spherical, it's potentially cubical, it's potentially the shape of a hand, right? It's potentially any number of things. And then I would take a ball and I'd wrap the fabric around it and I'd say, look, and now the potential for sphericality is made concretely real. And then I'd take a cube and I'd wrap it around it. I'd say, look, the potential for cubicality is now real. And that's kind of how Aristotle thinks about matter, is that what matter is ultimately this potentiality, that it's this raw potential to be something. It's the potential to be cats and dogs and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, right? Like it is the potential to be any number of things. And when you have an object, what you have is you have formal properties, right? Those structures manifest concretely within matter. And that's when you get a form matter or a hylomorphic, right? From the words hule and morphe, right? Form and matter, well, matter and form. That's where you get the term hylomorphic, meaning that the object you're looking at is a combination of formal properties with material potentiality, which is what gets you a concrete object. Okay? And so that's where Aristotle suggests that, like, yes, look, form is real, structure is real. When you look at me, you do see the manifestation of the formal properties of human. And so that's why in Raphael's painting, Aristotle is gesturing outwards and saying, look, the forms, right? They're out here. They're all around us. Now, for that reason, what you end up having is you don't have, strictly speaking, two principles. Yes, Aristotle does have a distinction between form and matter. That's true. But one of the things that's also true of Aristotle is he doesn't believe that form and matter are ever separable, right? You can't ever have pure matter. And the reason is because matter is nothing but pure potentiality. If you really got rid of all the properties, you'd have nothing, right? There'd be nothing left. It wouldn't be a concrete thing because it's just potentially things. And at the same time, you never have pure form, right? You never have just floating out there in the world the form of man, right? No matter how devilishly handsome the fellow may be that you happen upon, he is not the form of man. He is a form matter composite filled with accidental properties that could be changed, right? Size, location, position, color, situation, all these sorts of things. And so you never have pure form. You never have pure matter. You always have a composite of form and matter. Matter, potentiality, matter with concrete formal properties. Now, for that reason, I think what you end up finding in Aristotle is you find a very sort of this worldly type of anthropology that is also not dualistic. So first of all, you wouldn't have an impulse toward, if you're Aristotle, right? If you're an Aristotelian, you wouldn't have an impulse to suggest that matter is inherently evil or wicked or something like that. You'd grant that it's, unstable, that it changes, right? That it undergoes becoming and generation. But for Aristotle, that's not actually something that's wicked, right? That's just part of the nature of material things. And on the other hand, you don't have, like you would have with his teacher, the idea that the soul is some sort of separable object. Now, why? Well, according to the traditional reading of Aristotle, and there actually is a dissertation that questions this, that talks about the materiality of the soul in Aristotle, and I think it makes some important points. But again, we're just going with the traditional view of Aristotle here. That the traditional reading of Aristotle is that the soul is the form of the body. And so in this sense, what he is traditionally read as is that when you're talking about the soul, when you're talking about the thing that moves and animates the body, you're actually talking about the form that is within the body, right? And so here, the sort of form matter composite gets you that. Now, why is that important? Because remember what I had said about Aristotle. According to Aristotle, you can't have pure matter and you can't have pure form. You always have to have them together, a form matter composite. They are distinguishable. They are never separable. Well, that's critical because if the soul is the form of the body, then what that means is Aristotle cannot advocate the view of Plato. Remember what Plato had said about the nature of the soul, the idea that what the soul is really looking for is to be liberated from the body and return to the world of the forms, to join the communion of the gods, things like that. Well, the thing is, for Aristotle, the soul cannot depart from the body and continue to endure. And so this is one of the reasons why, for Aristotle, his ethics ends up becoming very this-worldly. So on the one hand, it is not dualistic because he doesn't treat matter as somehow evil. And it's also not dualistic in the sense that the soul is a secondary, separable principle that might be able to leave the body and go have an existence without the body, and in fact, a preferable existence apart from the body. And so for this reason, what you have with Aristotle is you have a focus on virtue ethics, where really what he's asking at the end of the day, when he looks at, if you're going to really simplify Aristotle's ethics, what he wants to suggest is that when you discern the proper end of the thing, what is the telos, right? What is the purpose of this thing? How you go about doing it is in a very simplified fashion here, to simplify his point. You take the genus of the thing and you combine it with the specific difference. So in the case of man, our genus is animal. But what makes us different from the rest of the animals? Well, we're rational. So man is a rational animal. And according to Aristotle, discerning the specific difference of the thing is also critical to discerning the chief end of the thing, okay? So let's think about it this way, right? You have an eye, right? And the eye is an obvious one. You can tell me without thinking too much about it what the purpose of an eye is. You're like, oh, I've got eyes so I can see, Dr. Jacobs, right? I have ears so I can hear, right? On the one hand, that's pretty easy. But let's just pretend for a minute that we've got to think through it a little bit in order to get there. We could sit here and we could talk about certain things that are true of the eye. We could say, well, it's an organ. Okay. Well, there are a lot of organs. In the human body, we've got a lot of organs, okay? So that's not going to tell us what is unique about the eye. Now, we could dig down into certain elements of it and say, like, it's got animal cells, okay? Yeah, it's got animal cells, and animal cells have, like, Golgi bodies and, things like that. Does that tell us, like, what it is? And it's like, well, the problem is, the eye isn't the only thing that has animal cells, right? There are other things that have animal cells. So if you were to go through this process and you were start to try to say, well, what's different about the eye? Eventually you would arrive at the fact that it is an organ that has the unique purpose of seeing, right? And so this is where Aristotle thinks that once you identify that thing that is unique about it, you are able to identify its chief end. Now, I say chief end because, obviously, the eye has all sorts of different components. There's all sorts of subparts to it, like animal cells, each of which has its own purpose. But they all are sort of cumulatively part of one organ, and that one organ has a unique purpose, which is to see. So that becomes the chief end of the eye. And identifying what is unique about it, what is unique about that organ, also tells you what its proper end or telos is. So its purpose is to see. Now, the reason this is important is because, according to Aristotle, if you can discern the specific difference of the thing, you can begin to discern what the proper end of the thing is. And so in the case of man, we could sit here and we could talk about different things that are true of man, right? We could talk about, the pleasure that we get from eating. We could talk about procreation. We could talk about, grappling or something like that, right? But the thing is, what Aristotle is obviously going to zero in on, which I'm sure you can anticipate here, is that what is unique about man is reason. And so, according to Aristotle, reason has to be central in some way to the telos, or the purpose of man. And here then, of course, reason has to do with discerning the causes, the order of nature, and things like that. This is one of the reasons why Aristotle is so easily paired with natural law, like you get in the medievals with somebody like Thomas Aquinas. Now, obviously, Aristotle's focus, if you've ever spent any time with Aristotle's ethics are focused on virtue, right? So the idea is, and specifically the pagan virtues. So if you're familiar with the pagan virtues, there are 4 of them. There's justice, right? There's wisdom, there's temperance, and there's courage. So Aristotle's ethics is ultimately aimed at, acquiring virtue, and specifically acquiring virtue through repetition, through the forming of habits. And here, habit is actually tied to like habitus. You have it, right? This is the sort of thing where it's actually ontological. And so within an Aristotelian framework, similar to what I had said about like piano playing when I was talking about happiness and that sort of thing, it is a potential that you have, right? These are actually substantive features of the person. You have the potential to learn to play piano, and through repetition, you end up developing that potentiality into actuality that is actually now a skill or an art that you have. It is now part of you. And the virtues function that same way. And so that's a big part of what Aristotle's ethics are about. And we'll talk more about that and virtue ethics in our next episode. However, for now, my point is just this. It's actually precisely because Aristotle doesn't have a certain substance dualism to him that he is prone to actually see the human person as one thing. And ultimately, for that reason, his ethics end up being very much focused on you and I in the here and now, much like discerning the purpose of an eye or the purpose of an ear, right? It is aimed at not some sort of liberation from the body, like in the case of Plato, or even liberation from evil matter, like in the case of the Gnostics or the Manichaeists, but rather it has to do with the current place of man within the cosmos in the here and now as a cohesive whole because of his hylomorphic metaphysics. Now, I would actually say at this point, I would transition over to some of the anthropology and the distinct anthropology and how that relates to ethics within Christianity and then the medievals and so on. But I actually think, lo and behold, I have gone much longer with this first episode than I anticipated. I actually anticipated getting through the medievals, getting through modernity, and getting into some of the quirky contemporary features of anthropology. And yet, I am looking at the clock and saying, I actually think this is probably the resolve of episode 1. So rather than 3 episodes, it looks like we're going to have 4 episodes, right? 2 episodes on anthropology, 1 episode on metaethics, and then 1 episode on specifically Christian anthropology, East and West. So 4 episodes, put an asterisk on that because, knowing me, that might turn into 5 or 6. But we're going to try to keep it to 4, so we'll see. So with that, we'll pick up here next time by talking about, touching on some of the Christian anthropology that gives way to the medieval anthropology, how that shifts in modernity, and then where we find ourselves in the wake of modernity with some of the anthropology and ethics that we find ourselves swimming in here today. And so with that, I'm going to sign off for today. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.